Welcome, addicts. All right, we are going to be breaking down tight end George Kittle for the San Francisco 49ers in this video. But hey, if you guys are looking for more analysis heading into the 2020 season, we'll be doing a player breakdown of all the fantasy relevant players. So hit that like and subscribe button, and also check out our website, fantasyaddictionnetwork.com, for a full list of rankings. But without any further ado, let's get into this video with George Kittle, beginning by looking at his 2019 stats. Now, missed 2 games due to a knee sprain and an ankle fracture, but overall had a very dominant season, continuing on from his breakout year in 2018, finishing the season with 85 receptions, over 1,000 yards, and 5 total touchdowns. The total touchdowns category is honestly the one that is the most surprising. He's targeted heavily in the red zone and just hasn't been able to seem to get past that hump. But we saw a similar trajectory too with Travis Kelce. He had a few years where he was dominating in the receptions and yardage category, but it took a while until he started to see a dominant touchdown total. So we're expecting this to eventually go up. We'll get a little more into that in a bit. But he finished with 222.5 fantasy points, which put him at second in the position. But he actually had 15.9 fantasy points per game, which was tied for first with Travis Kelce. So when you extrapolate that out, had he been able to play a full season, he would have been at a dead even tie with Travis Kelce for fantasy production, which I think is pretty important to remember going into the season. Right now, we do have Travis Kelce projected higher than George Kittle, but is he a whole round of ADP worth jumping? I would say no. So right now, George Kittle, if you're going to take a tight end early, George Kittle is my favorite value. I've been seeing him consistently go around the early third round in best ball drafts, and it's kind of hard to ignore the upside that he gives you there. When you look at his overall game stats, he only had one poor performance in Week 13 versus Baltimore, where he only had 3.4 fantasy points, but he had 5 blue weeks. Blue weeks for tight ends mean that he finished in the top 3 at the position. Also had multiple top 6 performances, those are those dark green, and then anything green means he was at least in the top 12, so basically a tight end 1 for the week. Now with tight ends, there's typically a huge gap between the top performers in a week and later on. So being a tight end 1 doesn't matter nearly as much, but still giving you those basically week winning upside for a tight end to be able to score well over 20 points on a consistent basis is pretty important, and really what ends up leading to a lot of championship teams is having a tight end that can give you that statistical advantage. Because if you're rolling George Kittle out there against a tight end that might only give you 3 to 5 points, then you're getting a massive upside boost as long as you can still fill out the rest of your roster well. So there's definitely a strategy that is worth noting if you can get a guy like George Kittle in the third round, especially if he ends up taking another step forward in 2020. When we look at some of the important stats to remember as well, he is number 1 in terms of tight ends for the respective target share on the team. He had 28.2% of the 49ers targets. And keep in mind, again, that is with him missing 2 games. So that could have very well been over 30% had he played the full 16 games. He's one of 3 tight ends to surpass 1,000 yards in 2019, and he is first in tight ends in terms of yards after the catch with 569. So he gets a lot of work, in the short and intermediate game, and makes a lot of yardage with those plays. Once he gets the ball in his hands, I'm sure many of you remember the play against the Saints that effectively won the game for the 49ers, where he took a really short pass and was able to move the ball all the way into field goal range for the 49ers. That's the kind of stuff that George Kittle is truly elite at, and why he's so heavily involved in this offense. Now, it's interesting. And looping back to our Jimmy Garoppolo video, Jimmy Garoppolo is actually the most accurate deep ball quarterback as in 2019, but he took some of the least deep ball targets. We also see here with George Kittle, he only had 6 deep targets, and that put him at 15th at the position. So with a quarterback that actually grades as the most accurate deep downfield thrower, you could expect George Kittle definitely has some upside and some room to grow in the deep ball targets as well, and that might also help with his low touchdown total. Right now, his average target distance is actually really low at 5.5 at 36, which probably makes sense because he receives a lot more targets than other tight ends. So if he's receiving a lot of targets that aren't deep down the field, it's definitely going to, by necessity, bring that down. But just something we wanted to point out. His catch rate is 79.4%, which is number 3 in the tight end position, and he only recorded 1 drop in the entire season. So if there's anyone to consider elite at any position, George Kittle is definitely that, and I feel that right now he's being a bit undervalued going in the 3rd round. We've seen guys like Robert Gronkowski and Travis Kelce and Jimmy Graham in years past go as high as the 1st round, and while I understand this year there's a huge drop off in running backs, there's a huge tier of wide receivers that we love in going around the 4th round. So if you can get George Kittle in the 3rd round, there's definitely a strategy around that. And at this point right now, with the ADP shaping the way that it is, I think that could be a league-winning strategy, especially if he hits more of his ceiling. Now, going into our projected stats for George Kittle, again, I feel like this is much closer to his floor, assuming health. Right now, we have him only projected to go up to 88 receptions, about 1,100 receiving total yards, and 6 total touchdowns, but that could very easily jump up to 100 receptions, 1,300 yards, and 8 plus touchdowns if the passing volume in the 49ers has to go up by necessity, like if their defense ends up not being as strong this year, if Nick Bosa ends up getting hurt, or they just have some regression towards the mean because their defense was so efficient last year. That's why we have the upside ranking of George Kittle at 5/5, because he could very, very, very easily become the number 1 tight end at the position and could even be a couple points per game ahead of Travis Kelce if everything goes right. Now, we're not projecting that because that's a less than likely scenario, but it's not hard to tell a story of where that actually happens. So again, while we do have Travis Kelce ranked ahead of George Kittle right now, I feel like they should be going right next to each other, and there's a big gap in terms of their ADP right now. So take advantage of that if you're doing a draft early. George Kittle should be a worthy consideration of a 3rd round pick if you can get over the fact that you can't grab one of those wide receivers in that tier 3 who we love very much. But I've seen a lot of those guys fall to the 4th round. So if you can, go running back, grab George Kittle in the 3rd, and still nab 2 very solid receivers in the 4th and 5th, that might be the most efficient strategy, at least drafting early on. But anyway, this has been the breakdown of George Kittle. As we mentioned before, we're going to be going over all the fantasy relevant players in the NFL one by one. So hit that like and subscribe button for more videos like this one. Check us out on fantasyaddictionnetwork.com for a full list of rankings, and we will see you guys in the next video.